Yeah, I thought it's like, and I try not to, it's a drawing. But the key is it's like it's fresh.
I mean, like,
I give them some words that I'm like,
yeah, here, yeah, bruh. So those are like triple ball. What if I go here? Guys, this is crazy. How do I? That's why I need that right now. He was just very
I didn't like the whole, it's quite interesting because surprising to think of it, full box, so, when I we never actually what is this meaning for my but it's the way of it's yeah, but it's actually because you show like allocation. Yeah. Sorry. This is my answer. I'm glad you using the other. Oh, yeah. I'm like, I wanted That should become It's good to get
Probably the whole thing.
Yes, sir.
Oh my gosh.
Hello, folks. Welcome, welcome. Why don't we find our seats? Plenty of seats to find. Great. People are still filing in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Great to see you all. This is the first of the spring 2025 architecture program lecture series. We're so pleased to have another great series in play here and to kick it off with a great lecture guest who we're going to introduce in just a minute. My name is Michael Osman. I'm Assistant Director of the Graduate Architecture Program, and joined here by Mohammed Garapur and Ken Filler, who are also in the administration. But thank you all for being here at our new start time for all of our lectures, 4 o'clock. And this event's going to run until 5:20, just to let you know. I also want to just take a minute and acknowledge and thank AIA Potomac Valley for working with us as a kind of liaison between us and the National AIA to provide us with continuing education credits for all the registered and licensed architects in the room. Thanks to Potomac Valley for that. I also want to note to all the students in the room, we are asking that you use that QR code here to register your attendance here at this lecture. Once you put your camera on this QR code, you'll be taken to a screen that looks a lot like this, where you're asked to just enter your name, your course number, and your instructor's last name. You do not need to add a photo. In fact, please don't. But do please put in those 3 bits of information, and that should be all you need to register and let us know that you're here in the room in attendance. So thank you for doing that. The QR code is also going to be on the next slide as well. So if you miss it here in a minute, it'll still be there for you to scan. This is going to be a process that we're trying throughout the semester as a way to figure out the attendance and let you guys be registered here. But now, with that, I'd like to introduce Dan Curry, lecturer Dan Curry, who is going to introduce our special guest. I'm going to hand the mic off to him.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. So I have the honor of introducing our guest today. Amira Osman is a Sudanese South African architect, a researcher, academic, activist, public speaker, and author. We are fortunate to have her join our ARC 402 studio today, where she led a workshop with the students on strategies for activating edges in urban environments. A little bit about Amira. She's a professor of architecture at the Shawani University of Technology and holds the position of South African Research Chair in Spatial Transformation. Amira is a joint coordinator for the International Open Building Implementation Network. She was also the past president of South African Institute of Architects, which convenes the conference series, A City is Not a Tree, the Urban Ecologies of Divided Cities, which launched in 2022. She's the director of the organization Platform 100, which is a think tank and collaborative vehicle for promoting change in conversations and practice around architecture, space, and cities. She's a registered professional architect and editor of the Built Environment in Emerging Economies book series. And along with Getchi Karuri Sabina, she is the author of Space, People, and Technology, Reclaiming the Narrative on Cities. We're very grateful that she's journeyed from South Africa to join us today. Please join me in welcoming Amira Osman.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you can hear me clearly. It's a great honor to be here. So I've a little bit provocatively called my lecture, Where is Wakanda? Who is T'Challa? The Sustainable African City Reimagined as a Livable and Lovable City. But I hope it will make sense as we go along in the lecture. So the second slide, it looked fine on my laptop. For some reason it doesn't here, but don't worry, the rest of the slides, we check them and they're fine. But this was on the poster and it just gives you a little bit of a background to myself. So the top left image is of Johannesburg, Gauteng, South Africa, a context that I've been in for a lot of my life and that I know very well. Below it was one of the last images I took in Khartoum before the war. It was 4 months before the war broke out in my home country, Sudan. And on the right, which sadly doesn't look very good here, but that is Cairo, where I was just speaking to one of your colleagues here. I was in Cairo for the World Urban Forum. And Cairo has suddenly become a very important city for us as Sudanese because a lot of Sudanese people left for Egypt after the war broke out. So there's cities that have great resonance with me and in my career. So let me talk briefly about my home country. I have many homes, but let me talk about Sudan. And these are just some images of Sudan. The one on the top is a development, which I'll talk about more, but parts of it were built, which is on the top left. That was what was built. So you can look at the city at that level, but you can also look at the city in terms of what's happening on the pavement. But as architects, a lot of times we like to look at those bird's eye views of cities, which is something that I'll discuss. So in 2016, I wrote an article called Sudan Student Protests Show How Much City Planning and Design Matter, kind of leading you up to where we are now in Sudan. I think it was in 2018 when the December Revolution broke out and overthrew a 30-year dictatorship, and I hope inspired the world in the process. 4 months before the war broke out in January 2023, I traveled to Khartoum for a wedding, just for a few days. It was amazing. I felt safe. I traveled the city alone at night. And that was what was happening 4 months before war broke out in my country. 6 hours before the war broke out, this is what was happening. Six hours before the war, we had no idea what would happen. We met under the stars. And it was a beautiful evening. We met in love of the music and the poetry, humanity, social events, beauty, and every note was around
المحبة
peace.
هي الحرية الوحيدة في هذا العالم، لأنها ترفع النفس إلى مقام سام لا تبلغه شرائع البشر وتقاليدهم، ولا تسوده نواميس الطبيعة وأحكامها. سلام على الذين لا تبدلهم حياة، ولا تفرقهم طرق، ولا تغيرهم ظروف.
and we will return. I've just translated fragments of that for you. And so the war broke out. I could say a lot about it, but I'm not going to say a lot. But one of the images that really touched me was this image of residents, just normal civilians at home in their courtyards, military airplanes above them. And one thing that I pinned on my Facebook was in 2024, January 2024, 19 million children had been out of school for 9 months in the Sudan, and they still are. Majority of them are still out of school today. I believe that my home city is a city deliberately, systematically destroyed, millions of people displaced, homes broken into, occupied and looted, businesses, factories, and libraries burnt. So this is our story. I believe that what is happening in the Sudan is an occupation and a land grab. I don't think it's a normal war, but that's not the topic of this lecture. So I picked this up from Facebook. Someone who's actually in the USA said, we owe so much to Khartoum, my hometown. We were made by Khartoum, and Khartoum made us who we are. And I often say, I am a product of Khartoum. I'm a product of Khartoum University. So when the war broke out, I wrote quite a bit. This was an article, a love story to Khartoum, which was published in Italian, but I do have it on English on my website if any of you are interested. In 2023, I gave a lecture at Brown University titled Dreaming of Rebuilding While the War Rages On. Again, not the topic of this lecture, but I just want to give you a bit of context for my ideas around cities in Africa. So many years ago, I drew this, which is an old map of the Sudan, the region I come from, and the ancient civilizations that inhabited that land over a long time. And it was the topic of my PhD at the time in 2004. But since the war broke out, I became aware, or more aware. I've always been aware of it, but more aware about how I've often focused on the north-south, that is along the Nile, and the influences it had on my culture and the place that I belong in the world. But when the war broke out, we became more starkly aware of this Sahel region and the influences that it has on the Sudan. And since then, I've started reflecting on that, and hopefully I will write about that. But when I did do my PhD, I started looking at the context in terms of the history, geography, cultural and theoretical settings, and trying to develop a theoretical framework for studying that particular context. These are some images from that study at that time. One unique feature of the Sudan is that every urban center, almost every urban center, developed around a burial place of a sheikh, a religious teaching school. It is just how urbanization worked in the Sudan. And so I went on in my studies to try again to develop a theoretical framework by which I could interpret those urban centers in the Sudan and the built culture in the Sudan. Again, some images. These are of one of the religious centers in the Sudan that I have used often in my studies, the ancient ruins in the northern Sudan. Modernism in Sudan is also something to be aware of. The campus of Sudan University. My father is an architect. This is where I spent a lot of my childhood. We actually lived on that campus. And for a few years now, I've been working on my father's archives. My father has he practiced for many years in Khartoum and has built prolifically in Khartoum. I hope not everything is destroyed, we hope. And you will find the OSAC Archives website online. So for a lot of time in my career, this is what I did. No computers, everything hand-drawn. That is how we did it. So My parents' house in Khartoum has been occupied by the militia for about 2 years. Our story, or one story, isn't more or less important than another. I think every story of war is important. So this is my dad's house, very kindly being drawn here by my ex-student and current collaborator from the Congo, Nathan Kabinga. So my host country, also home, very much home, but South Africa, complex context because of apartheid planning and even laws prior to apartheid. There were so many laws put in place in South Africa to shape the cities into what they are today. To shape the city so that the white city could have cheap black labor, never integrated into the city, but always close to it, to service the city, but not to be a part of it. So these laws generated, you can see on the left, the tennis courts and the swimming pools and the very lush landscapes. On the right, you can see single-sex workers' housing, very much designed like prisons, and you can see the very notorious matchbox houses. That is where the black labor lived to service this wealth. And sadly, you might have come across some of these images by Johnny Miller. The conditions in South Africa have not really changed. Just have a look at the contrast. So 30 years into democracy, the conditions in South Africa have not changed. So I believe that the built environment is not neutral. All forms and man-made landscapes are value-laden, they contain meaning, and planning, design, and technical solutions can hinder or enhance participation, or they can exacerbate difference and disadvantage. I said earlier, we love to look at cities from a bird's eye view. That's what we like to do. This is Warwick Junction in Durban, South Africa. And it's one of the cases that I always use when looking at the competition in cities between authorities, big capital, and communities. But if you go down from this nice bird's eye view, this is what you find. One of my inspirations, the person I reference a lot is Nabil Hamdi. I hope some of you know of Nabil Hamdi. And he says that we often like to sort out the mess in cities. And he says, don't try to sort it out, engage with it. And that messiness is something that we really, looking at a bird's eye view, it's just the easy thing to do. This is the level at which we need to be engaging. So one thing that South Africa did after apartheid, or when it transitioned into a democratic government in 1994, is try to provide housing. Now, I know there's some is better than this, but it's generally, this is the principle. It's peripheral, it's monofunctional, it's single houses on a plot. We had a session now in studio. Perhaps looking at this will help the students understand why I'm so passionately against the object building, a building that doesn't relate to the site edges, etc. So this is the kind of environment that was ultimately created, and Black South Africans continue to be disadvantaged. I believe that space has power, it's political, it's not neutral, and it has meaning. Space tells us, are we valued, are we important, and do we count? Space excludes, humiliates, intimidates, and angers. And one of my favorite quotes, I have no idea who said it, I use it often, is create inhumane environments and people will respond likewise. I don't think it's by chance that South Africa has a very high crime rate. So people are angry. We're also known as the protest capital of the world. People are angry, and for some reason, if there is serious protests that break out, serious destruction to some housing, I get called by the media to comment. So I've gotten used to this thing that if if a TV station is calling me, has a fire broken out. So whenever there's protests like that, I get called to write or speak. And these are just, I think this was in 2016 or 2017 when serious riots broke out in South Africa. I wrote, South Africa urgently needs to rethink its approach to housing. 1,800-word document that ended up probably being the most influential little piece I've written in South Africa. And I thought it was very straightforward in terms of what we need to do in housing. In 2015, I also wrote What Architects Must Learn from South African student protests. And because I like a few provocations to keep the conversation going, but this is something I really believe in. You'll see I've been using this slide for 5 years because I fixed the number of years in the one place and forgot to fix it in the other place. So I believe that nothing presented in South Africa today and in the last 30 years, sorry for the typo, in terms of visions, images, spatial design, technology, policy, and economic models, I believe that nothing has been presented that is as powerful or has captured the imagination as did the intentions set out in apartheid spatial planning and its socioeconomic intentions. Its intentions were terrible. I've stated now, its intentions were to retain cheap Black labor to service the white city. But nothing has been done to reverse that. It's still the same. So 30 years into democracy, this is still what we're stuck with. So what's happening? These are the two contexts I know, Sudan and South Africa. What's happening in the world? So I just made a habit the last couple of years, every country I go to, I look at the Gini coefficient, which shows us inequality. I look at the Human Development Index. These are rankings in terms of the world, and I look at unemployment levels. Yesterday, I added the USA. So you probably know the figures better than I do. So I hope I just did a quick, Google search. But it doesn't seem that the USA is doing that great in terms of inequality. But if you go further down, South Africa is #1 in terms of inequality. And very sadly, tragically, actually, it has held that position for a long time. I see Brazil is doing better now. So again, create inhumane environments and people will respond likewise. I just want to, I'm actually going to skip this slide if that's okay, you can read it. But I just want to go to this one. In terms of inequality, can resilience be achieved in societies with high inequality? David Dewar in South Africa many years ago said, successful urban environments are environments that work for the rich and the poor. South African urban environments do not work for everyone. Greater economic equality, not greater wealth, is the mark of the most successful societies. I've put the references there for anyone that might want to look at it later. And the life diminishing results of valuing growth above equality. It's not just the poor, but whole societies from top to bottom that are affected by inequality. Which leads me, giving you that background. So where is Wakanda? Who is T'Challa? And how can we reimagine an African future? This is very much an article I wrote for this publication. I can't remember the date, 2021. And one of the anecdotes I often tell, like it was a yay moment for me, was after the reviews and everything, the editors contacted me and said, this is a scientific publication. We're not comfortable with the word lovable. And I made such an effort to define lovable in terms of technology, management, etc. And it got published. It's like my biggest achievement. I got lovable into I often tell this anecdote. So where is Wakanda? Is it a place? Is it an idea? And please don't quiz me on Black Panther. Probably everything I know about the Black Panther is what I say here. So do not quiz me on that, but I'm happy to have a conversation. So who is T'Challa? Who's this African hero? Who are the African heroes? Is it an individual or is it a collective? We need to explore approaches that may achieve more egalitarian and equitable societies, yet nothing presented today, like I said, is really capturing our imaginations. And maybe that's why Wakanda is such a, it's an interesting concept to investigate. Like, at least it's an attempt. How can we realize change in Africa? But what happens is that future visions of African cities tend to resemble Wakanda. It's high-rise. I showed you the images in Khartoum. High-rise glass and steel structures, the materials and the colors, have a very particular identity. And the reality is many African cities have a version of Wakanda or Dubai that is either partially realized or as a plan. There's one slide I showed, I passed by it quite quickly, but in the background, you see Kigali in Rwanda, and it's this shimmering CBD. And you saw the Sunut, which is in Khartoum. I think it's coming again later in the slides, but a lot of African countries aspire to something like that. So what I did in this particular book chapter, it was an anecdotal narrative combined with an analytical text and a literature review where I tried to reimagine the African city. I used case studies like Warwick Junction, which I just shared now, but I also looked at things like Taksim Square in Istanbul and the riots that happened around the Khartoum structure plan, which I mentioned just now. And a lot of these protests happen because of a perceived lack of access to city space and a restriction on opportunities. I also reflect on awarding. I mentioned Alejandra Ravenna to the class I was just with in studio from Chile. Remember, I'm doing all of this from a South African lens. So when Alejandra Ravenna was awarded and his work with low-income residents in cities came to the fore, there was a bit of negativity among South African architects. And yet when Zaha Hadid, a star architect that passed, she was like highly praised on her passing. And there was a lot of debates generated around the social responsibility of architects. I've often written and spoken about what do we reward in architecture, and it's something that I think we need to reflect on. So places inhabited by the poor and where the poor carve out livelihood opportunities continue to be highly disputed, and there's always an ambivalent relationship with city authorities that are never fully supportive. Warwick Junction in Durban, I mentioned that that's one of them. So while such contexts might be represented in tourist brochures as something to visit, or they have a special identity, the city never fully acknowledges their presence and doesn't extend them the same level of services it does for other parts of the city. Rod Hackney in the UK many years ago referred to this kind of relationship between cities and their residents as official vandalism, and that term has really resonated with me over the years. So in this article that I wrote on Wakanda and T'Challa, I did a little bit of a literature review looking at what people had written about Wakanda. Urbanists and city planning experts agree that some of the design and infrastructure of the fictional place have real life possibilities. The streets of Wakanda are seen to be pedestrian-focused and commerce-filled, which is perceived as being desirable in a high-density African city. Wakanda also shows a mix of futuristic glass and steel towers with African-inspired imagery. It looks like regional architecture as opposed to this anywhere-ness. I use the term in studio now of placelessness. that we seem to have in our global architecture these days. I saw architectural expression that was not only organic, but of its place and its culture. This is one author that I referred to. Often when we think of Wakanda, we think of the shiny towers. Production designer Beechler turned to the architecture of Zaha Hadid, Buckingham Palace, and Afrofuturism when reflecting on Wakanda. And these authors say a new form of urban colonialism driven not only by external Western or multinational investors, but also by native ones and by local and national governments who share the same interests as international elites. These are just, or this is just some of the literature that I referred to when I was working on this article. So I'm coming again to my hometown, to Khartoum, and that planned development. Actually, one of the, it was partially realized, one of the towers burnt down during the war. And again, I was called by the media, like, we want you to talk about the tower that burnt down. And please remember how hard that is when I say that 19 million children are out of school. But I spoke about the tower, I guess. Any publicity is good for a neglected war, but that tower really, it got some attention. But Khartoum's Sunut development has been called the Dubai on the Nile, Sudan's Manhattan, and an urban forest of Sunut trees was destroyed in its development. My mother, who's very wise, said they have removed all the trees, built the neighborhoods and called them after the trees. And that's why it's called Al Sunut. And you can actually find many neighborhoods in Sudan where that has, or in Khartoum where that has happened. So I actually posted something about this and a friend put this on LinkedIn. She said, I'm remembering Joni Mitchell's 1970s lyrics. They paved paradise and put up a paving lot or a parking lot. So many African cities, again, images from Khartoum. These are my own photographs. Many African cities aspire to become world-class and progressive and modern. And these aspirations often leave poor communities disadvantaged, silenced, and hidden. The imagery that is used implies a scale and an interface with the public realm that is exclusive and exclusionary. It does not relate to the finer grain of existing urban fabric, and it does not imply a relationship with the streets that encourages different levels of commercial activity. And the imagery also, in terms of its massing and implied materiality, is highly problematic and lacks sensitivity to climate and context. Smaller, and this is really key, smaller and more subtle interventions and successes are not as visible or compelling as the imagery linked with future visions of cities. These small actions have immense catalytic and transformational capacity or potential, but they're less captivating and sometimes invisible, but they're crucial for the survival of many. That is actually Kigali. It's a photo I took in Rwanda, and you can see the shimmering skyline of the city in the background. So we need to question images of Africa as sold to us through various narrators, sometimes not Africans, and sometimes African governments and African people have bought into these images. And I think ideas of Wakanda need to be critically unpacked and how that relates to our value systems as Africans. I've mentioned Dubai a few times, and this was taken from my hotel window in Dubai a few years ago. I actually spoke at Dubai Expo, and I really criticized that form of the city as being quite alienating. And again, we like to look at the city from a distance, but I did try and walk the streets, which are not very walkable. And during that time, I was rereading Arrival City and thinking about the people that inhabit these cities and that service these cities. So I spoke about cheap Black labor being close by, but in every city in the world, we have an equivalent. Where do they come from? maybe from a rural area in Pakistan or Bangladesh, I don't know, depends on the city, I guess, but they come and they create communities and they service the city. So this idea of having cheap Black labor might be quite alarming, but it actually happens in every city. And for me, walking those streets was really difficult, but it was really important because you see things that you cannot see at a bird's eye view. So I'm just leaving you with this question: who belongs in the city and who doesn't? Who belongs and who doesn't? So a lot of times I've shown you the flashy pictures. My day-to-day work takes me here. These are communities that we work with, and this is the messiness that Nabil Hamdi speaks about, people making a life for themselves, and a lot of times being subjected to the official vandalism that Rod Hackney speaks about. So this is an invitation. Let's write our own stories, our own histories, develop our own narrative, our own technologies, and envision a new, more evolved, pioneering way of inhabiting our cities and the world. So over the years, I've used this question: what does transformation look like? Because I'm chair in spatial transformation, I thought, there's a lot of people doing things on social issues, economic issues, management issues. But for me as an architect, what does transformation of cities look like? And how can we build inclusive and resilient cities? One of my absolute heroes is Albie Sachs. He was a freedom fighter during apartheid, lost his arm in a car bomb, became the first constitutional judge in South Africa. And he writes in the Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter. I actually love this section. And I sent it to his wife, and she read it to him, and he said he can't remember writing it. But it's so beautiful. He speaks about how the change, the transition in South Africa was so planned and willed and negotiated, and how many years it took to realize it. He says here, did things just happen, or did we make things come about? Nothing that we had done had just come to pass. And this is really my invitation for us to, again, have those conversations and those long meetings. He makes a joke somewhere that we would have a free society long before we have a meeting-less society, because that's the amount of effort it took to envision a country post-apartheid in South Africa. Something else that inspires me, and I've used it often, and for those listening who might have heard me use this before, is my favorite short story in the world is The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World by Garcia Marquez. And I'm going to read a section of that. It's to inspire us to think differently about the environment. So this village, which was quite ugly, found this beautiful drowned man on their beach, and they decided to give him a very dignified burial. And once they did that, they knew, I'm reading now, they knew that everything would be different from now on, that their homes would have wider doors, higher ceilings, and stronger floors, so that Esteban's memory could go everywhere without bumping into beams. They were going to paint their house fronts gay colors to make Esteban's memory eternal. And they were going to break their backs digging for springs among the stones and planting flowers on the cliffs, so that in future years at dawn, the passengers on great liners would awaken suffocated by the smell of gardens on the high seas. And the captain would have to come down from the bridge in his dress uniform and his astrolabe, his pole star and his row of war medals, and pointing to the promontory of roses on the horizon, he would say in 14 languages, "Look there, where the sun's so bright that the sunflowers don't know which way to turn. Yes, over there, that's Esteban's village." So I often try and think about what would inspire us, like Albie Sachs was inspired to develop or help develop a constitution for a democratic South Africa. like these villagers transformed their village. We have to, as architects, we have to have a contribution in helping envisioning an alternative future, an alternative way for us to inhabit our cities. And I think it's a global issue. I don't think, there's very unique Sudanese or South African or Egyptian problems, but it's very much a global issue. So, how do I translate that into something doable? How do we design for unknown futures? Distributed control in the built environment, who makes which decisions when, understanding cities infrastructure in the built environment in terms of levels, systems, and connections. The idea of disentanglement, making changes to one system without disrupting others, and mediating between individual and collective aspirations. This is very much open building talk. I acknowledge my colleagues and the writers on open building, and I most of all acknowledge John Habraken, who recently passed away in the Netherlands. And I believe open building gives us an opportunity to speak about participation in a deeper way. I think a lot of talk about participation is perhaps a little bit naive. So participation, I'm going right at the end, a well-known South African planner. I think that sentence is so profound. Participation is not about asking people what they want, as people's expectations are experientially determined. So people will want what they know. So we as architects have to help them imagine an alternative. People's expectations are experientially determined. There is such an important role for the design professionals. So many years ago, with colleagues, we developed a 10-point vision for transforming existing and new neighborhoods in South Africa. We just worked in studio on point number 5, street edge activation as a condition for development approvals as one of them. I'm not going to go into any details here, but another provocation: are smart cities a dumb idea? Because I find that we don't really think, again, deeply enough about what smart cities are. And I've kind of taken a stab at it. I don't claim to be any less dumber than anyone else, but I'm trying to be self-reflective in my practice. So I just put here, smart city has developed and advanced tools and mechanisms to manage stability and change, the formal and the informal. It's an inclusive city. It embraces complexity, the unexpected and the unknown. In that little sentence, I'm borrowing from Habraken, from Hamdi. I'm borrowing from open building authors. It's really, it can be unpacked in many ways. So the call is for a global partnership. The idea is to be political, not necessarily to be a politician, but to be political. And there is a difference. And thanks to a colleague that alerted me to that, I stood there a little bit tongue-tied and I said, I'm not a politician, I'm not a politician. She said, you're political, but you're not a politician. And since then I've used that term. This is what I do in my academic texts. The Urban Ecologies of Divided Cities is a book series and a conference series that I started, educating citizen designers, a chapter there about my approach to teaching. Open building in the Global South, I've borrowed quite a bit now from open building. I have a website where I present a lot of my community engagement work, and the book series that was mentioned now. So please, these books are available open source online. I'm very present online because I see myself as an activist for these issues. I try and keep focused with my online presence. My much neglected podcast, but also a website where I try and keep it up to date. And then these are some of the invited contributions, always after a crisis, always after a crisis. Why can't we try and plan for things rather than wait and be shocked by the crisis? So that was in the Mail and Guardian, and this is in the conversation. We need to develop an alternative approach to the built environment where Africa becomes a pioneer and where innovations are found at the interface of various professions. It's an approach where higher level strategies enable project level innovations. Because a lot of architects will say to me, oh, but we work on site, we can't. And I have an argument for that. Higher level strategies enable project level innovations, but at the same time, project level innovations can inspire policy change and strategic decision making at a higher level. So we need to reimagine the African city as a livable city. My definition being equitable, beautiful, functional, has diverse opportunities, offers people a chance at improving their lives and livelihoods. The African city as a lovable city. And I did unpack this more for the editors of that publication, but lovable is very much an open building term. I borrowed it from open building practitioners, and it resonates with many people over many years, accommodates and embraces diversity, choice, and change. It's embedded in context in terms of culture and climate. So if I'm not mistaken, I have 3 minutes left, and I would like to read a text very briefly. It's not long, but it's a text that I've been working on for, I think, maybe 5 years. And I keep adapting it and changing it. And sometimes I call it a poem and sometimes I don't, but if you will bear with me, I'll just read through that as a conclusion to my talk. So it's called I Will Take My House With Me. This is a narrative inspired by a conversation with a woman in an informal settlement in Pretoria, South Africa. I've actually read it at multiple events, but every time I've added a layer to it. So maybe after my Maryland visit, I'll also add another layer to it. I will take my house with me, was her response when I asked what she would do if her shack was demolished. There is a simplicity and intelligence to this logic. Why are we stuck on the idea of permanence in African cities that are defined by transience? Even daily rituals within the house are not fixed. Makeshift kitchens are set up when and wherever needed. There's very little stuff that could weigh one down when needing to transition. The nomads of the desert see possessions as a curse that the settlers along the Nile have to endure. Rooms are courtyards and courtyards are rooms. Spaces are multifunctional. Activities depend on the inclement of the weather or the visitors who may unexpectedly show up at the door, or a sudden death, not necessarily in the same house, but maybe in a neighbor's house, which necessitates that the beds be removed from the rooms, mattresses be put on floors, and doors be opened wide. One house might become for men only, while the other becomes for women. This may happen in a wedding. What was private is no longer. The house becomes the temple or the mosque when used for religious ceremonies or prayers for large groups of people. How can we bring a coffin? This is a question. How can we bring a coffin into the main bedroom if my father passes away? A question I was asked as project architect for a rural house in South Africa. We have no space to set up the tent in the yard. We have to put up the tent in the street. This was said with a lot of indignation in South Africa, in a particular community in South Africa. Our dead have no dignity, laments a lady at Eersterust, a colored township in Pretoria. Yet in Sudan, this is an accepted practice. Tents on the street is an accepted practice. But for her in Eersterust, our dead have no dignity. The street in Sudan becomes the house when more space is needed for eating, sleeping, or receiving guests. What was simply transforms easily, efficiently, and quickly when circumstances change. Sacred areas may be as simple as stones placed on the ground to denote a sheikh's tomb. Ceremonies happen around it. Religious gatherings happen in the gaps of the urban fabric. Worshippers, you see them in South Africa in flowing white robes, occupying space for their rituals. Or performing Eidgah in public spaces as per the Sunnah of the Prophet, placed temporarily inhabited. The meaning is contained in the act rather than the artifact. Subtle, tangible elements may be used, flags might be left behind, the remains of a fire, nothing is fixed, everything is constantly changing. The house, sacred space, building as a thing is of little significance. The temple is the halaqa, a group of people worshipping, the maddahin, the people praising the Prophet or praising Allah, a circle of people singing the praises of Allah or the Prophet. The house is the activities. Bet also means family in Arabic. The tomb is a slightly raised mound of earth, undifferentiated otherwise, and it becomes a site of visitations and requires great significance. The mosque is where people stand, face Qibla, and perform the ritual and leave. The physical artifacts of temple, house, tomb, or mosque are unimportant, or even in some cases non-existent. Where they do exist, little significance is attributed to them within a Western mindset. The yearly plastering festival of the Jannah Mosque in Mali is a unifying feature and a symbol. The built form changes with every replastering. This expression of community building and shared ownership is at odds with a modernist perception of architectures that are fixed, conceptualized in the mind of one person and preserved as precious or unchanging heritage in a rigid understanding of conservation. In Islam, as an example, no place is necessary except for Hajj in Mecca. Sacredness is embodied in the body of the worshipper rather than on the physical space, a praying person rather than a building. In a halaqa, in an open space, in a landscape, everything else is simply left to disintegrate, merge, and disappear. So I sent this to my doctoral student and friend and colleague, Tariq, who then added a final sentence, until we ourselves disappear. And that is what I will conclude with. Thank you.
Cool. No, actually, I'd love for you to stand because now we'll open up for questions. And I'll look for hands and pass the mic. Lots of questions. Who's got them? Oh, here we go.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much. I know it's a somewhat difficult question, but if you could credit one person for inspiring you, who would it be?
One person. I've mentioned a few in my talk. I'm absolutely influenced by John Habrakan. For me, he's my architectural hero. He passed away recently. The idea of open building is very much based on his books and on supports, which was published in the 60s, 70s, I can't remember now. But he's definitely, I often say I see the world through an open building lens, but this is not an open building lecture, so I didn't delve too much into it. But my interpretation of cities and space and building and architecture is always based on the principles that Habrakan promoted. Which leads me to something that I said about what is valued and what is celebrated and what is awarded in architecture. I think that's a highly problematic thing because we're very stuck on the idea of images. We're very stuck on the idea of object buildings, and we're very stuck on the idea of what's it called? Star architects. And, you know, with respect to a lot of beautiful buildings, which I myself get excited by, but a lot of my heroes, my architectural heroes, are people like Habrakan and Nabil Hamdi, who didn't win the awards in architecture. And I think the architectural profession needs to be a bit self-reflective in that regard. Does that answer you?
So I have a question I'm a little nervous to ask. I feel like you said that you're an activist and I can hear your message very clear. Do you personally believe that that is something that can change and happen in today's world? Especially, I feel like the problem is more psychological, like a psychological change, if my question makes sense.
Psychological. What, are you an architecture student?
Yes.
So what's your skill? Design.
Well, for mine, my focus is sustainability and equality, but a lot of construction is powered by money.
Hmm.
You said something about Africa becomes a pioneer, but in what sense does that actually happen? Does it happen with people from overseas contributing to that, or is that more of a, I don't know how to word my question, or if you know where I'm heading with it.
Yeah. Well, it's a conversation, so I really appreciate your reflections. Thank you for that. I attended a colleague's professor inauguration at the University of Pretoria, and she made quite a bit of effort in her talk to say, I am not an activist. And then she would talk a bit, and I am not an activist. And I say with absolute pride, I am an activist. so, you know, kind of, I was quite interested in that position. Architects also like to say, oh no, I'm not political. I'm not political. And I often respond, the statement is political. I am not political is a political statement. So you have made a political position, or you have a political position, even if you deny it. And you know, psychological is an interesting term. But why I said, are you an architect? I mean, even if you're working on sustainability and something else you mentioned, it's you. How do you do that? Through design. Why are or are smart cities a dumb idea is a very deliberate provocation. I'll share an anecdote and I hope it makes sense to you. So in that fancy hotel room I was in Dubai, I opened the window and the air conditioner automatically switched off. So is that a smart building? I opened the window automatically. I tried it a few times. I thought, oh, cool. You know, this is clever. If I open the window, the aircon switches off. But the building was all glass, you know, steel and glass building in a desert climate. It was poorly positioned on site. It did not respond to orientation at all. It was heavily reliant on mechanical systems. It's a dumb building. I don't care if the aircon. So that's what you do as a designer. That's your contribution. That's my activism. Like my talk in Dubai was, let's get the first year principles right, and then let's use the technology. So that's how you become an activist, not through being a politician, but through being an architect, if that makes sense to you. Does it answer even if a little bit?
It does.
Thank you. I can't use.
Oh, okay. So I fully agree with you, and I really like your position on like architecture being political, because I mean the built environment is something that is a huge change in the world already. Like you're literally building places for people to exist in. So my question for you is, as an up and coming architect, how, especially one in like America, how do you recommend we like navigate or like find places or firms that align with like our political beliefs in a way, if that makes sense, or like apply activism in our architecture?
Thank you so much for that question. I think in a way I've already answered it, but I don't know your context very well. So please, I also admit my limitations here. But, just generally from my context and globally, what is awarded and what is valued, exactly what I said earlier, we need to reflect as a profession. So these very messy contexts that I showed, remember I showed some images like a bird's eye view of cities, but then you go on the ground and you engage with that messiness, as Nabil Hamdi said. Now, when you engage with that messiness, our architectural institutes, regulatory authorities, awards do not acknowledge that you're engaging with that messiness. They prefer that, that you do move back and design a nice building. And, usually it's an object building. It doesn't necessarily have to do anything in its context. You don't have to question a brief. You don't have to. There's a South African architect. He's from a firm called Earth World Architecture. And his name is Andre Ekstein. And I actually use one of their buildings as a case study in a book chapter I showed, Open Building in the Global South. And I think what he does is absolutely profound, because he argues that even if you have big buildings, you can try or you design them, and he has done it, design them in such a way that you don't need big machinery, that you can employ emerging contractors, that it can be carried, every component can be carried by 2 people. He involves local communities. So even if you get a conventional building to design, you can question the way. And that's what I meant about site level innovations. Perhaps ultimately, if we have enough of those, that's your activism through design. You start challenging the profession to change. But also at a higher level, perhaps we can start awarding the people that work in informal settlements and do that kind of work. That's our activism. When I talk about activism, it is very much design architecture activism. I know I haven't given you a solution, but I hope I've inspired a few ideas that you can go out and work on and challenge, your profession in that sense.
Hello. Sorry. Hello. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you for your lecture. I really appreciated the insight that you gave into how like African culture interacts with the architecture in the area, like especially that poem at the end, or not poem, depending on.
I also don't know what it is.
I thought it was a very beautiful way of describing how the culture of an area influences like how buildings get used, or what takes place in the streets and such. I was wondering, as somebody who has traveled the world, if you have any like other examples or any other insight into that relationship between culture and architecture.
Thank you so much for that question. I think that text at the end really focused on acknowledging, and I know UNESCO did that many years ago. I remember I wrote a little article for them on Sudan, but it acknowledges intangible culture. And sometimes in Africa, what is valued is not necessarily tangible. But again, to go back to the question that your colleague just asked, it's not what our profession values. So while, in other disciplines and generally we've come to acknowledge intangible culture, we still fall back on celebrating the very prominent, the object building. I think that's kind of when I go into other cultures, I'm trying to look at how people respond. There's something I said in studio this morning. And again, I think it was David Dewar, the South African planner, that said it, and that's negotiated reactions. So in a lot of vernacular contexts, those negotiated reactions, kind of a context emerges organically and people respond to what's already there. It's not like an empty slate or canvas that you work on. It really evolves by responding to the constraints of your surroundings. And there's also a quote by someone called Turin, very old reference, but he said vernacular architecture is town planning or it is nothing. So in a lot of my writing and my thinking and my practice, I like to dissolve that distinction between planning and architecture. So I think those are the kind of, in these vernaculars are what we need to be looking at in various contexts. I hope that makes sense. Hello.
Hello. Oh, hi. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was very helpful. I was just wondering if there was a city example or something that we could look at for like inspiration that fits the criteria or is as close as possible, something that's there that we could look at and be inspired by.
Thank you so much. So at the risk, are my South African colleagues online, any of them? At the risk of making them a bit unhappy with me, I really don't think there's any example to look at in South Africa. And I've often said that, and I say, I'm happy to be challenged. Show me where the innovations are, where the experimentation is. I actually argue that in South Africa, we need to invest more in innovation, experimentation, and pilot projects. I don't think we're doing, and that's why we're stuck with the structure of the apartheid city. However, I just spoke about the vernacular now. There are lessons in the vernacular. Believe it or not, there are lessons in informality and how things emerge. Emergence is a term that Nabil Hamdi uses. And there's lessons to learn in those emerging or emergent processes. And if we can design in such a way that allows for a level of control and a level of constant, continuous change, those different levels of the built environment, those different agents of decision-making in the built environment. I know I'm speaking more theoretically than in terms of practical examples, but those are what I would look at and try and replicate going forward. And that's why I really would like to see Africa become a pioneer in terms of doing things differently, devising systems to allow for those kind of contexts that accommodate everyone, that are livable and lovable and resonate with everyone. But I've mentioned vernacular contexts and the lessons we can learn from that. And there was something else I wanted to mention. Oh, yes. And there was something I mentioned in studio today, where we also, when we have a car-dominated environment versus environments that are that emerged organically over time and where the buildings defined the streets and the public space. Those are the contexts that we end up going to, visiting, admiring, spending our holidays at, yet we don't design in that way. So that's just something to think about.
Hello? Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Can you raise your hand? There you are. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmah.
Hi, thank you for a really insightful lecture. As an architecture student, I'm really wondering, what are the ways you believe architectural education can address inequalities in the built environment?
Oh, in many ways, in many ways. I was just saying to one of your lecturers, I can't remember who, that in our South African studios, we are very concerned with very deep issues. In our studios, we are concerned with crime, inequality, social challenges, gender-based violence, you know, and those are just things that come on my desk as research proposals, as project proposals at master's level. We're very, very much immersed in these issues. I don't know what your issues are here. You know, I need to spend a few more days in studio to find them out, but our students are very, very alert to that. I've written a chapter in a book. I would be very honored if some of you would have a look at it, but it's about my teaching approach over many years, over my career. And the book is called Educating the Citizen Designer. So it's, again, my activism through design and through my profession. So, yeah, but sometimes one of the things, and I think this is a decolonial project in my mind, is that we allow students to come with their stories and their context into the study. So a lot of times I'm trying to see if I remember some of the project themes. But you know, birthing rituals for a particular South African group, you know, that's made it into our studios. Queer spaces in inner city Johannesburg, that was one theme for a project. Quite a few students doing things around Muslim spaces in South African cities. When I joined this particular department I'm in, when I joined it about 7 or 8 years ago, when I came, it was so incredibly, it's a University of Technology. It was amazing projects. It was airports and conference centers and shopping malls. And you looked at those drawings and it's like a full set of working drawings and it was beautifully done. But at the moment, our themes are very different. So it's still very competent, very beautiful. It's still design-based, but it's addressing very real issues in our society. And that's how our education has transformed over the years. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
In your slide, there's a picture of a neighborhood in Cairo, and I can relate. I'm Egyptian myself, so I lived in a neighborhood that looks exactly like this, and things like that, the narrow, you know, road and the buildings next to each other define you as a person and who you are. So in the search of designing a Wakanda, how can you design a city that improves people's living experiences without totally deleting their history or where they come from?
Thank you so much. I met a South African professor at the World Urban Forum in Cairo, and we both teach about cities and urbanism. And she's a renowned professor. I look up to her. I reference a lot of her work. She came up to me and she said to me, I wouldn't know what to teach about Cairo. Like, we felt completely out of our depth. I have a feeling that a few lectures later, a few years later, I'll maybe be able to add my reflections about Cairo. But there's a lot of retrofitting that needs to happen in our cities. I know that South African cities, there's a lot of retrofitting. We need to work with what's there and to aim to improve it. In Cairo, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, this particular place was Faisal. I don't know if you know Faisal. Like, I don't know what we can do with that place. I really don't. So Marie Hoxemer, if you're listening to this, you know, I don't know how to teach urbanism when it relates to Cairo. I mean, if I look at the number of people contained in a particular, you know, area, Cairo is so incredibly complex. So there's all of these satellite towns. Their solution is to develop new towns, which I don't think, it's kind of killing the heritage of the city in a way. So once I figured out Cairo, please send me an email and I'll tell you my opinions of it. It's just too complex. But it was also a very personal thing for me because so many Sudanese have moved there, and we're very appreciative to Egypt for accommodating them because they literally saved their lives. But it's a complex context.
Wonderful. So I want to thank you and tell you that we're grateful to you for sharing your activism with us, sharing your stories with us, and we're enriched by your ideas. Many of us earlier today were also enriched by you spending time with us. You were in the 402 studios for 90 minutes. You brought a fascinating provocation that I understand was open-ended, and students were grappling with that in a way that was really healthy and creative. And the fruits of that were on the walls of the great space. So I want to thank you for touching in with our community in that way as well. So will you all join me in thanking Professor Osman?
Much for having us. Thank you. Let me just step over my hands. Hi, I'm also just walking. She's here. And I'm just, yeah, I think